Welcome to this year's first Branigin lecture. My name is Fred Amon. I'm the director of the Indiana University Institute for Advanced Study. And I want to say a couple words about Branigin lectures in general before introducing our distinguished speaker this evening. Our Branigin lectures are made possible by an endowment from the estate of Mrs. Jean Lois Porteous Branigin, an IU alumna. And since 1999, this endowment has supported a series of lectures that bring to the Bloomington campus interdisciplinary scholars and artists of great distinction. In addition to lecturing, Branigin scholars and artists meet with a variety of faculty and student groups while they're on campus, and they share their wisdom and their talent in both formal and informal settings. And it's a great honor and pleasure to introduce our first Branigin lecturer of the year, Angelo Pizzo. Angelo Pizzo is an accomplished screenwriter and film producer. He grew up in Bloomington, and he graduated from IU in 1971 with a BA in political science. He attended film school at the University of Southern California. After beginning his career at Warner Brothers Television, he moved to Time Life Films, where he eventually became vice president for feature film production. He is perhaps best known for his film Hoosiers, nominated for 2 Academy Awards, which he wrote and co-produced. The film is now in the Library of Congress's National Film Registry and has been declared by ESPN and USA Today as the best sports film of all time. This was followed by Rudy, which he also wrote and co-produced. And both films were directed by his former college roommate, David Anspaugh. Pizzo and Anspaugh collaborated again on a third film, The Games of Their Lives, released theatrically in 2005, and it will be shown tomorrow in collaboration with the Union Board in Wittenberger Auditorium at 7 p.m. in the Memorial Union Building. Mr. Pizzo will be on hand to discuss the movie and to answer questions then as well. After 30 years in Southern California, Angelo Pizzo moved back to Bloomington in 2004. He's pursuing new film projects and along with his wife Greta, raising 2 young sons. In addition to working on films, he serves on boards of the Heartland Film Festival and the New Harmony Writers Project, and he's also served on the former Indiana Film Commission. He received an honorary doctorate from Franklin College and was its commencement speaker in 2002. He's been the recipient of the Thomas Hart Benton Award as a distinguished Indiana University alumnus and of the Governor's Arts Award for contribution to the arts. He was also named a Sagamore of the Wabash, the highest civilian honor given to a resident of Indiana, and the Branigin Lectureship is our way of honoring his creativity and welcoming him home. Angelo Pizzo's films are about the intricacy of everyday aspiration. In each of his films, the focus is on ordinary men and women as they learn to make goals out of their dreams, against all odds or alone. They are not simple stories or pat assurance that hope and struggle will be rewarded with success. Rather, through sports, private struggle in a very public place, Pizzo chronicles in detail an era before ours, what our own generation likes to call a simpler time. Pizzo shows us how very unsimple those times were, for men and women who wanted to make something of themselves, and yet would of necessity do so with the opportunities available to them close to home, here in Indiana. Acquiring self-knowledge, coming to terms with others, knowing the world, forgiving, abandoning cynicism. These are just some of the struggles his protagonists face as they learn first to dream livable dreams and then to live them. In our own times too, even with their much vaunted limitless horizons, dreaming livable dreams and coming by second chances remain powerful struggles and powerful stories. They are they are never any one person's story alone. And Angelo Pizzo's portrayals of the creative courage of everyday living challenge us at a level that only art can. Mr. Pizzo's lecture this evening is entitled Running the Gauntlet, From the Movie in My Mind to the Movie on the Screen. He will take questions after his talk, and after that you are all cordially invited to join us for a reception upstairs opposite the Sofa Gallery. Please join me in welcoming Angelo Pizzo.
Well, that was pretty impressive. Whoever wrote that analysis of my movie, I kept on thinking, who was he talking about? It's very strange. I think that I certainly don't. People who do creative things don't try to analyze their own work. I think you're in trouble if you do. I don't want to hold this thing the whole time. Okay, thanks. This seems weird. Okay, we're off to a great start. I can hold it. I feel like I'm at the dentist office.
That's painful.
Great. Okay, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Ivana and Fred. It's quite an honor. I looked at the predecessors who did the Branigin lecture, and I don't even feel like I'm in their company. But it's going to be a lot of fun talking to students and faculty this week, and I really enjoyed last year's lecturer, John Crowley, and I was struggling to figure out what to talk about, and Ivana wanted a title to the lecture. I'm not even comfortable with the word lecture. Let's just talk about it as a talk. Lecture sounds, I'm going to lecture you, son. But I gave her the title From the Movie in My Mind to the Movie on a Screen, the struggles, the perseverance, so on and so forth. And I realized when I just kind of threw it out there, it was partly glib, partly inclusive of everything I've ever done in my life, practically. And I realized that I could teach an entire course based on that lecture. If I talked about each film alone, that would probably take 2 or 3 hours. So I'm throwing that topic out altogether, and I'm about to come up with a new topic. My plan for peace in the Middle East. Why are you laughing? No, I'm going to talk about a part of the struggle, and the movie in my mind part, and that is screenwriting and the screenplay. Whenever I give a talk somewhere, I always anticipate the kind of questions that I imagine I would get. And I get so many questions about screenwriting and screenplays. And it's not easy to talk about in a certain kind of way. I will just say this alone. I've never wanted to be a screenwriter. I wrote my first screenplay at the age of 31 after being in the business for 8 years, being at film school for 3 years. And while I was sitting down writing, I was wondering why I was there. So I guess what I want to talk about, and ever since then I've been writing screenplays, I want to talk about how I got there to that point, what I learned along the way, and I guess the title of this lecture would be The Making of a Screenwriter, Me. And in so doing, I'm going to talk about what my aesthetic of the screenplay is. When I get questions from students, oftentimes, not oftentimes, every once in a while here, I really want to be a screenwriter. What do I do? How do I go about doing it? And the first thing I say to them is, are you sure you really want to be a screenwriter? Is it something you aspire to? And why would you aspire to be a screenwriter? And I try to disabuse them of that goal. And I try to reorient their thinking in a different kind of way. And that's what I want to talk about in terms of the definition of myself as a screenwriter. I don't think of myself as a screenwriter. I think of myself as a filmmaker. And I do write screenplays because screenplays are the most important part of the filmmaking process. But they are only a part. And if you have a goal to be just a screenwriter, what you're doing is basically saying, okay, I'm going to write the movie in my mind, the movie I want to see, and then I'm going to hand it over to some other people who are going to make a completely different movie. So what I try to get students to think about is, if you want to make movies, if you want to make that movie in your head that you're transcribing onto the page, do everything you can to know everything else about the process, and do everything you can to either produce it or direct it. Because if you don't, that movie you wrote will have very little resemblance to what you see at the end, unless you're very, very lucky. Now, I know that people are intimidated by the idea of producing and directing, and they think, well, I'm going to do that, or you should do that because it's a way of control. It's not really, you shouldn't think about screenwriting as a enclosed process and that you're trying to control, because control is not the right word. You have to be fluid. It's a plastic medium. Nobody really thinks about, okay, here's my screenplay, now I can publish it. Nobody aspires to write a great screenplay and then put it on a shelf. No one reads screenplays. And honestly, no one cares if you've written a great screenplay and someone has made a bad movie out of it. Maybe your friends and your family do, but it's the oldest and sorriest song in Los Angeles. And that's one of the reasons I never aspired to be a screenwriter, because I knew it was a thankless profession. How I ended up getting there, I will start talking about now. And the influences of how I end up thinking about screenplays and making movies. Now, I'm going to do it chronologically because it's the best way to organize my thinking here. And in so doing, I will talk about as well a student trying to do the same thing. Let me say, everything I am about to tell you is an opinion. Every successful person in the film business, screenwriter, director, so on and so forth, has a different story, and they have a different aesthetic. I'm going to be parenthetical and go sideways every once in a while, but I have a great deal of respect for a certain writer and director, and he called me up. I'll just tell you the story. It's a guy named Gary Ross who wrote Big and directed Seabiscuit. Well, he originally sent me the book and asked me to write Seabiscuit. And I loved the book, and I said I could do this, and I was excited about it. And we had dinner together and to celebrate our great collaboration. And at the end of the dinner, he looks at me and we said, okay, so tell me, what is your process? How do you go about writing? In the course of 20 minutes of that discussion, I lost the job. Because his way of approaching and writing and making that screenplay go from an idea to 120 pages was completely counter to my own. I'll talk about how we are counter later on. But I'm saying he's not wrong. There are many people who do it differently than I, but this is my process. When a student says, should I go to film school? Is this a good idea? And I would say it really depends. There are a lot of factors, but generally I would say if it comes to undergraduate school, no. If it comes to graduate school, no. Undergraduate school, liberal arts. Learn everything you can about everything else in the world except movies. Because movies is part of your life. It's part of your passion. It's why you're interested. And that passion and that interest starts from a childhood perspective. And that certainly happened for me. I fell in love with movies very, very early on. And I remember the movies that meant the most to me. And those are the movies that moved me, that stirred me, that made me feel like I was a jet or a shark when I came out of West Side Story. That I wanted to pick up a sword after coming out of Ben-Hur, El Cid. I loved the biblical epics, Lawrence of Arabia. All these films had a great impact on me. I could probably analyze it further and talk about how a lot of these stories helped me understand what it meant to be a man or a male, an adult, but that's really not the point. The point is I connected to the experience. I connected to the process of losing myself. One of the things that I feel sad about is happening in the business today is it's changed quite a bit. The best writers are in television. Most movies are now are cartoons or simplistic action adventure films. The kind of movies that I fell in love with early, when you go in and absorb them on the 70mm screen, they reach you in a very deep place. They reach you in the unconscious. And of course, when we're kids, we don't really talk about or analyze what it is and why we're moved by something. But that's where it started. That was the spark. That's where the love interest began for me. The second thing that I think was very important for myself was the amount of reading I did. I read passionately. I read boys' series, which is a genre form, and movies are all about genre forms. I read all the people that interested me, all the authors interested me were great storytellers. That's what I responded to, great stories. Whether it was Alexander Dumas, whether it was Charles Dickens or Mark Twain, this is where you really learn how to write screenplays. This is really, because screenplay at its very essence, screenplay writing, is narrative. It's telling stories. Everything else is a far second place to that, telling stories. I was fortunate insofar as there was, I'm dating myself, but there were only 3 channels, I think, on television back in the 50s, so I didn't really have a lot of choice except to read. But nonetheless, I'm jumping ahead here about the film. I'm going to go back to the film school, in and out of it. But if I would say, beside liberal arts, a liberal arts education is taking courses in history, his story, taking courses in political science, because God knows you need to be political to be successful in the film business, anthropology, sociology, on and on, all the things that impact the culture and society we live in. These are the contexts. You really have to understand the context of the stories you're about to tell. And whether you understand them intellectually or rationally, logically, linearly, it's all about feeding the computer. It's feeding the computer. And what reaches your unconscious is as important as what reaches your consciousness. And getting back to the film school thing, instead of spending $43,000 a year is what USC costs now, take that $43,000 a year, watch 500 of the best movies ever made, read 100 great books, and then with the rest of that money that you're doing those things with, buy a digital camera and make a movie. I think I can teach you everything you need to know about making a movie in a week. I certainly believe that I could teach you everything you need to know about writing a screenplay in a couple hours. Now, actually executing it is a lot more difficult. There's so many people who disparage screenwriters and screenplays, and certainly that's it's always been the case in the business. Sam Goldwyn said, writers, they're schmucks with underwoods. And pretty much the same attitude, mentality exists today. And it's really supported by the press as well. When you're reading reviews of films, you rarely read about the writer. When you read, if they're promoting the fall releases, you always get the film connected to the director. And if you see like these books about video guides, they're always the director and never the writer. But I ask you, if you were building your own house, who would be more important to you, the architect or the contractor? Now, that's actually not a totally accurate analogy or metaphor, because blueprints oftentimes blueprints are used to describe what screenplays are, but they're not really blueprints because blueprints are specific. They're down to the quarter inch of what you have to do in building a house, whereas there's a real plasticity to screenplays, and there should be. When I finish a screenplay, I'm fully aware that this is just the foundation on which the house is going to be built. And because of the amount of collaborators that are going to come into play, the actors we cast, there are many things that are changed, locations we are going to find or not find. I don't want to talk about actual filmmaking. I won't talk about that part of it, but I will say that the next part of what impacted me as a screenwriter, how I ended up there, was I did go to grad school at USC, and I was there for 3 years. Now, I never imagined being a filmmaker or actually working in the film business. I went to USC to get a degree in an area called History, Theory, and Criticism. My approach was academic because growing up in Bloomington, you're sort of taught that if you fall in love with something, you get a degree in it and teach it. Maybe not taught, but that's sort of part of what this world is about. And I knew it was the only way in which I could be connected to something I felt that was my love. It was my way of making a vocation out of an avocation. And it was just a burgeoning field. And I took a couple of courses here at Indiana. There were only 3 or 4 courses offered, but there were 3 schools in the country at that time that gave out doctorates. One was USC, UCLA, and NYU. And I went to USC because they were just starting their program there, and I'd done so much preparation, so much reading in this area that I knew about as much as a number of the people who had just been assigned to that program. So it was a lot of fun at the beginning. I got carte blanche to watch all the movies I've always wanted to watch, and I went in there with an attitude of writing my thesis, and then coming back and teaching somewhere at a Big Ten university, maybe even Indiana. I was going to knock on Harry Gettle's door, at a certain point. But that never happened, and I'll tell you why it didn't happen. There was this main school of thought at the time in analyzing films was called the auteur theory. And that was the way in which you studied, analyzed, broke down, wrote about films was as they were expressions of the director. So one would focus on Alfred Hitchcock or John Ford or Claude Chabrol or the director was God. And this was a theory espoused by a group of French critics, the Cahiers de Cinema magazine, and it was popularized here in this country by Andrew Sarris, a New York critic. And it was the ruling way of thinking about film at the time. I certainly have realized and learned since that it was a bunch of bullcrap, that the auteur theory is absurd. And I was bothered by the wide variations of film by a lot of directors, even revered directors like Howard Hawks, and that I started to see similarities in different films between writers. I was even drawn to it back then. However, what I found much more interesting was a new school of thought that was counter to the auteur theory called the genre theory of film, which is the best way to organize and understand and write about and think about films is how does each film vary from its genre. So rather than study the films of John Ford, you study the Western. And how does John Ford's Western compare to Howard Hawks' Westerns, and et cetera, et cetera. And my doctoral thesis was called the Films of Arthur Penn, the Genre Theory in Analysis. And it was kind of getting the best of both worlds. Arthur Penn directed Bonnie and Clyde, The Left-Handed Gun, Little Big Men, which were sort of not send-ups, but he would take existing genres and he would turn them, the expectations, the conventions of the genre, and he would flip them. And it was a way of understanding and thinking about film in a different kind of way, and it appealed to me. Now, That was fine for the first year or so. But I realized after my master's thesis, which is the preliminary version of my doctoral thesis, I was told that I had to go much deeper and much broader. So the deeper and broader was to go into, I had to now utilize a much more intellectual approach to film, utilizing Claude Levi-Strauss's structuralist approach to anthropology, linguistics, Vladimir Propst's analysis of folk tales, Roland Barthes, a French philosopher. Christian Metz was a study of semiotics, a study of analyzing, deconstructing movies by using signs as different language. I mean, all this is, I'm getting like crazy even thinking about it now. It got so bad that I realized there was this moment, this epiphany, that there was the ruling magazine at this time, trying to collate all these ideas, was a British magazine called Screen Magazine. And I realized that 3 of the articles in Screen Magazine were so theoretical, they were so much about the theories of theories, that no films were actually even mentioned in those articles. And I was getting as far away from the thing that I fell in love with by intellectualizing my approach that I started to fall out of love and becoming very, very disenchanted. At the most serendipitous time, I was on campus at USC. Some guy came across with a sheet of questions, and it was like, they were like Jeopardy questions. He said, fill this out and you'll win a prize or whatever. And so I filled it out, and they looked, he said, would you like to come and be a test contestant on a game show? And we'll pay you $15. I said, sure, I needed the money. That sounded like fun. Well, I went, and they asked me back, and they asked me back, and they asked me back, and I was pretty good at those kind of general information questions at the time. Not so good these days, but then I was. And they asked me ultimately if I would be interested in writing questions, and I said, sure, they'd be paid 50 cents a question, and it would be, you need 3 references, and I thought, yeah, well, it was great. So I did that. It just so happened that the company that asked me to do that was called MTMAM. It was Alan Ludden, who had the old College Bowl, and Alan Ludden's partner was Grant Tinker. Grant Tinker was married to Mary Tyler Moore, and had the company MTM, who made all those great sitcoms, including the Mary Tyler Moore Show. I got to know Grant. He said, well, we gave some credit to some UCLA students who just came and interned here. Maybe you could work that out with USC. So I went to USC, and they agreed to let me intern what turned out to be the last season of the Mary Tyler Moore Show. And I can tell you that was a great thrill. And I really, what I say, learned a lot. I learned a genre I ultimately had nothing to do with, but I certainly started to see how these things were put together at these shows. Then Grant Tinker's good friend needed someone to do research for him for a television series called The Fitzpatricks, which is in the dustbin of history. But there were an order for 14 episodes, 1 hour. It's a 1-hour family drama like the Waltons. And the producer knew nothing about the Midwest, and it took place in Flint, Michigan. So I went and interviewed with him. He hired me. I turned in my research. We had a long talk, and a week later I get a phone call from him and say, would you be interested in being my assistant? My assistant quit, and I need you 14 hours a day for the next 6 months. Whatever you're doing in film school, you've got to drop. So I went to my counselor and said, I need to take some time off because this man promised me that he would teach me more about making movies and about movies in this period of time than I could in 10 years in film school. And of course the counselor laughed and said, well, if you do this, I'll never see you again. This has happened too many times before. He said, you'll be seduced by the glamour and the fun of it and so on and so forth. And I said, no, I put way too much work in, way too much work. Completed my master's thesis. I'm only a couple hours away from, my orals. And of course, I put everything in a box, and I've never opened that box since. But this man did, in fact, teach me more about film than in that 6-month period than in 3 years in film school and in my life previous to that. And what he taught me was there are so many elements that one just takes for granted and and don't ever think about. Costume, the details. The details. Movies are all about details. I learned about editing. I learned about how a scene is lit will change the tenor and tone and mood of it. I learned about how to spot music, where to place music, what kind of instruments. Casting. I was always in every casting session and learned about what people were looking for and what worked and didn't work, and how if you hired one actor, it would sound different and change the whole coloration of the scene and so on and so forth. But more than anything, I spent a lot of time with the writer. Now, in 1-hour dramas in Los Angeles, there's usually one writer who writes every script. You may see other names up there. I mean, Aaron Sorkin, who did West Wing and now does Studio 60, or David Kelly does Boston Legal. They don't make any pretenses. They have their name on everything. The reason is they created the show. They know the characters. They have the voices of the characters inside them. So this wonderful writer, a guy named John Sacred Young, taught me a tremendous amount about writing and thinking about writing. He even challenged me and asked me if I wanted to write. And I said, absolutely not. I had no interest in going into a room by myself. Now, making movies is fun. Being in development is fun. Doing, the excitement and feeding off of the collaborative energy of these other wonderful people was great. But just generating it myself, I had no faith and no belief that I could do it. But at that point, but he did teach me a number of things about little details about how to move in and out of scenes, how transitions between scenes, how important it was. That you just can't, there's a lot of things that people take for granted. The critical thing about writing screenplays is that the screenwriter is never obvious, that everything feels like that it's natural, that it moves, and that people talk like that because they're meant to talk like that. It's not like some clever writer putting clever words in the mouths of those characters. Someone came up to me after seeing Hoosier and said, I feel like, it was somebody who grew up in Indiana, was a friend of mine, and he knew a lot of these people that I based these characters on, and he said, I feel like I could have written that. And I was one of the greatest compliments I ever received, because I wanted people to feel the accessibility. And a lot of that is, and it's not easy to do that. And it took me a long time to learn how to do that. The next step was probably the most critical in learning about writing a screenplay. I was offered a job in development, what they call development. The title was Manager of Movies a Week and Miniseries for Time Life Films. I then moved to do a director and vice president, then into feature films. But for the first 4 years, I worked in the Movie of the Week area. And in that time, what my primary responsibility was to work with writers. And if we would go in with a writer and pitch an idea to a network, they would buy it, and then I would supervise the writing of that script. Now, I didn't know, I learned a lot during that time. I pretended I knew more than I did, and I had a great deal, I had a lot of fun, but I functioned totally as an editor, not as a creative person. I probably read over 1,000 screenplays in that 6-year period. Did I learn how to write? No, I didn't learn how to write a screenplay reading those 1,000 screenplays. I probably learned what not to do more than I learned what to do. I learned what traps to avoid. And I will say this about the screenplay form. Of that 1,000 or so screenplays I read, I could probably name 5 that I thought were great, and maybe 25 that were really, really good. Now, when I think about novels, the ratio is much higher. I think about, maybe these are things I don't know about. I don't know what it is, but part of it is the feeling that everybody can write a screenplay. It's a cliche that everybody has a screenplay in them. Everybody's writing a screenplay, from the busboy to the gas station attendant in Los Angeles, and it's pretty much true. Last year, there were over 100,000 screenplays registered at the Writers Guild. It's absolutely amazing. And there are a number of reasons that they do it. One is they they feel that it's accessible. They feel that they can write. They feel that they understand what movies are about, and that it's simple. And how many times people have grumbled, well, I could have written a better movie than that I just saw. I think there's also a bit of a lottery thing, that if you strike, you hit it, you can hit it big, and that there's a glamour factor of it, but actually after getting to know a lot of actors, that goes away real fast. And there's also a sense that there's also way too many screenwriting classes. I'm not a believer in screenwriting classes. I hope that Dennis Reardon isn't here tonight. But I'm not a big fan for a lot of reasons, and I'll get into them in a second. But I'm saying this for two reasons. Anybody can write a screenplay, but very few people can write great screenplays. My son is 12 years old, is now working on a 7th screenplay. And honestly, a number of them are better than a lot of the stuff that I read in Los Angeles. But he's writing from a pure place, and he understands the form, because I'm a member of the Academy and I get sent screenplays to vote for the films for the Academy Awards, and I allowed him to read the R-rated screenplays because this is his only way to access that form. So he probably read over 150 screenplays. He doesn't have to have anybody tell him how to write screenplays. He intuits it. But, and here's the key, and here's what I found that was probably the most important lesson during that particular time. In talking to the writers and discussing just general writing with the writers that I admired the most, and talking to the writers who wrote the great scripts, they all had a couple of things in common. One is they had a great passion and love for film. 2, they'd never taken a screenwriting class. and 3, they had a particular personal connection to the material. So many of the screenplays that I read were written from the outside in. They were written with the design, I'm going to figure out this formula, this screenplay formula. I've read this book on screenplays, and I know there's money into it, there's glamour to it, and I'm going to make it work, because there's a 3-act structure, there's rising action in page 20, there's a plot point on page 27, and I can't tell you how many of these screenplays that I read that you felt that they're all figuring out the formula. They're trying to make it work thinking about it from the outside in. The great writers write from the inside out. They write from their gut. They don't write from their head. They're not the kind of people who say, let's see, this Pirates of the Caribbean meets Spider-Man. And I can't, that was always part of the vast majority of, no, that was the vast majority of the scripts I also read were people trying to imitate the latest hits. And again, it's next to impossible to try to be mimetic in this area. You have to be unique. The vision, the idea has to be fresh. You have to be, it has to be personal, and they ultimately have to be not about movies you think that other people want to see. They have to be movies. It has to be first and foremost a movie that you want to see more than any other movie in the world. I think it was J.D. Salinger in the Seymour that said, "Writing is easy. All you have to do is think about the greatest novel ever written and write it just for yourself." And when I sat down to write Hoosiers, I had no expectation that anybody wanted to write it, that was going to ever make it or ever read it. But I wanted to write it. And I'll sort of get to that point in a second, but first, before I get there, I have to tell you how ultimately I ended up doing that. The company that I worked for, Time Life Films, was in a lawsuit with the other studios about HBO, because HBO was getting all their movies and they're trying to come up with their own pay channel, and it's a complicated lawsuit. Anyway, they had to disband their production unit, and I had just signed a contract. They paid my contract out in full. I was financially independent for the first time in a long time. I had an idea to make a movie about basketball in Indiana, and I really, really wanted somebody from Indiana to do it. And I actually tried to, when I was working at Time Life Films and feature films, I put the word out to agents. saying, do you know anybody from Indiana? Now, I brought this up before, and I have to be very careful about how I say this. It was the reason is the movie Breaking Away. A movie, by the way, that a lot of people think I wrote for some reason. I don't know why. But I do know why, because I grew up in Bloomington, and it's a film about Indiana. But Breaking Away was a movie that actually works very well, and it deservedly won the best Academy Award for Best Screenplay. But I didn't recognize any of the people in this movie, or people that I knew growing up in Bloomington. It was like they were from a foreign country. And it was a generic, to me, despite, even though specifically you could see the locations in Indiana, it was more of a generic college town. It could equally have worked in, I don't know, Eugene, Oregon. And it didn't matter. But if we're going to do a movie about Indiana and basketball and call it Hoosiers, it mattered. And I'll get back to the details. The way a person walks, the way they talk, the way they move, the way in which they relate, the pace, the rhythm of their behavior. All those things are absolutely critical. As I said, the details are mind-numbingly enormous. And if you don't get them right, then you're thrown out of the movie. I'll just give you one example in Hoosiers. We spent 2 months trying to get the uniforms correct. Not only did we do the research to get the right material at the time, but it had to be in coordination with a certain palette that we were trying to use. So my initial idea of doing it black and gold, which were Mylan's original colors, didn't work for the palette. Then I thought, okay, let's make it red and white, Indiana's color. That really didn't work. So we did test after test after test. And sometimes the actual material to the naked eye looks perfect, but when it goes on film, it will bounce light in a way that doesn't work. So I mean, this is the tiniest of details, but if you don't take the time and effort to get it right, then ultimately it will spill over on other details, and then you have not a slapdash, but a lot of people are there just to show up for work, get their paycheck, and go home. But if you're vigilant, if you have vigilant people and people who care, luckily our costume designer went to Indiana, and we tried to hire as many people from Indiana as we could. We really thought that would help us, and I think it did. Now, I'll get to the last part of it. I don't want to go on too long. I realize that I'm sort of at the end of how long I'm supposed to be talking, but I want to talk about the actual writing of the Hoosiers too, because having learned and thought about and conceptualized everything that happened to me that I just talked about, when I finally sat down, am I jumping ahead? Obviously I didn't find somebody from Indiana to write it, so I decided to try my hand at it. When I sat down to try to write it, I did something that I was instructing my writers who I worked with in the previous 6 years. That was to write an outline. Write a detailed outline of everything that's going to happen. That way you can create the structure, you can create the motion of the narrative, and there's going to be a real security that you're drawing out the map, that you know where you're going. Well, I tried to do that, and I could not do it. I couldn't do it for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons I discovered is that I didn't know who these characters were. I was inventing these characters. I had not given them voices. I didn't know what character A was going to do in C13 with character D. The other thing that would kill me, and what it took me, we had a summer house in northern Indiana, and I went up there for 6 weeks, and I churned out all of maybe 15 pages, and I was frozen. And the reason I was frozen is because the part of my brain which had been so well developed in graduate school and then working as an editor in the film business was all about objectivity, rationality, linearity, and it was the critic on my shoulder. Every time I wrote a scene, I went back and looked at it and deemed it terrible. and it was not up to my standards. It was a hopeless task. I actually called my friend who originally I talked about, it was the first mentor I had, John Sacred Young, and I said, I can't. I write a scene, and I go back over it and read it, and I can't keep on writing. It's a loss of nerve, a loss of faith that I can do this. And he said to me, gave me a little pointer that I live by, and I write the same way today, is never look back, never reread anything that you've ever done. And I go from page 15 to 16, and I keep on going till fade out. Even though I know something has changed in the process of writing that film, I will not go back until I'm done with my first draft. That way I don't have to second guess myself. Now, that was one thing. The other thing was discovering that the most important thing in storytelling is feeling it, is going into a deeper place, into that subjectivity, into that other side of your brain. What is the left brain, right brain? I'm always confused which side of the brain it is. But I don't even think about it as the brain. I think about it goes somewhere in your heart, your soul, your stomach. And conjuring up those voices, because the voices of those characters that you create are going to help you tell that story. And they're going to determine if a scene has authenticity or organic truth to it or not. I'll just give you one quick example, and I'll wrap this up. I know I'm going on too long. And that is that when I initially conceptualized the character of Shooter, that is the drunk father of one of the kids, it was a device to get the coach close to the kid, get the coach to become a surrogate father and sort of take care of him and connect to him. But when I had the character of Shooter, who was just completely a character that I wasn't really interested in utilizing in the story, when he walked on the court the first time when he was drunk, I knew that the character of the coach had to interact with him. And I felt there was a connection between the two of them, like a mirror image in some ways, a shadow in some ways. But more important than that, because that again is conceptualizing. What happened in that time was, boy, it was so easy to write that character. His dialogue came out so strongly, and I thought, well, you know, I'm going to give that character another chance to show up in the movie. So the next scene, I had a coffee shop scene, and he insisted. I couldn't keep him out of the movie. He kept on wanting to come back and insist on being part of the team and so on. And honestly, this is the great thing about writing, and the magic thing about writing, is when that happens. And it happens when you find the voice. I find the conceptualizing part hard. I find writing in general very difficult. In fact, making movies is hard too, but I actually enjoy it a lot more than writing. Dorothy Parker really said it best. I think it sums it up for me. She said, I hate writing, but I love having written. And I think that if someone dropped $10 million in my lap and said, you know, you can do whatever you want the rest of your life, I would try to stock away enough for my family, and I'd figure out how to use the rest of that $10 million to make a movie. But I will continue to write. And because it's what I feel. It's not what I know, it's what I feel. And it's a process that's important to me as much as I dislike it. And I hope to be doing it the rest of my life. That's going to be it for now. I think I've talked my time. Thank you very much. Any questions? Okay, great. No, I saw a tentative hand go up.
Yeah, you said you were going to get into why you weren't a fan of screenwriting classes, and I just wondered if you could do that. You didn't.
Well, I tried to imply when I said that the problem with most of the screenplays I read were that they're written from the outside in. they were planned, and the structure was dropped in on the process, on the story, rather than it grew organically. Let me tell you a little bit how I write. And by the way, in the first story, what I wanted to get back to, Gary Ross and I, the way in which he writes from a very structured detail outline. And he wanted to work in collaboration. He wanted to sit down and work on that outline with me. I said, I can't do it. I can't work with you that way. It's impossible. Because the only way in which I can do what I do best is to find those voices internally. And I have to find them in the process of going on the road. I impose some structure in this way. I know where the movie is going to go. I know pretty much what the protagonist wants. But I don't know what's going to get in his way. And I'm going to throw up obstacles. I'm going to create conflict. That was one. I did take a screenwriting analysis class. Now, if you call screenwriting class a screenwriting analysis class, that's perfectly legitimate, and they're interesting classes. Then you can break down Casablanca or Jaws and figure out what works or doesn't work. But that doesn't mean it's going to work for you. So what I want to know is somewhere that if I'm going from Bloomington to Miami, I want to know that I'm going to be stopping off at Atlanta or maybe one or two other cities. And I know specifically that's where I need to go. But I don't know what's going to happen in between. Someone described the best movies are, and I work in genres. I work it's a mass cultural medium. And because of that, you have to find a way in which to utilize existing story forms and existing genres. But how did he say it? He said, it's taking the familiar and taking a familiar scene or a familiar story and making people feel like they've never seen it before. That's part of the trick. And it's almost like using the same journey, kind of the same trip as a metaphor of, even though you've gone from here to Indianapolis, if you're a filmmaker, you want, how many times, hundreds of times, you want to create, and you think you know what you're going to see, and you think you know what the story is, but the way in which you do it makes it feel like you're seeing it for the first time, even though you know you're not. Anybody else? Yes?
Did you see the film The Illusionist?
I haven't, no.
Because what you're saying now just seemed to epitomize that film. Because there was an endpoint, but how they got there was just circuitous, but it was the details of the lighting, the costuming, were so heartfelt.
Yes, and the details are so many, and that's what I alluded to earlier. Part of what is important about being a screenwriter is to know what's possible and not possible in the whole art of making films. And you can't do that just if you've never been on a film set, if you really have never, if all you've done is watch movies. I continue to learn. I learned more on The Game of Their Lives, which didn't do as well as Rudy and Hoosiers. I learned twice as much on that film because of the things that went wrong than on Rudy and Hoosiers. But that's another story.
I was thinking about the last thing we were talking about how you said that you like the production aspect a lot more than the actual writing. And I know that Woody Allen said that he hates every aspect of filmmaking except for screenwriting. He says he hates directing, he hates acting, he hates everything about it. But he has to do it because it's the only way he can preserve his vision of the screenplay.
Yeah. Well, Woody and I think exactly the opposite.
Well, I mean, I know that he writes. He seems to say that he can write really easily. And I was wondering, since you were saying that you find that the process is not as enjoyable as the production, do you find like the screenwriting process arduous, or is it just kind of unnecessary, something you have to go through?
Yeah, it's arduous. I think one of the reasons it's hard is because it's not like I'm writing an article for a newspaper. I have to go deep. It's an emotional place. I have to write from an emotional place, so I have to get myself into that place. And you know, I don't want to go there every day. it's a raw, vulnerable state, and you don't feel so protected, and the reason I like production is because I enjoy the collaboration, the energy of other skilled professionals, and being on a quest to, all come together, having the same goal of making a terrific movie. And even if you're down and you're exhausted, someone will pick you up. When I think back on Hoosiers and Rudy, I don't think about writing the screenplay. I don't think about that at all. I don't think about the success we had afterwards, whether it would be at a screening or people patting you on the back, whatever. It was all about the making. It was being in the trenches with my brethren and making those movies. Those are the powerful memories I'll have about those movies. Yes? Hey, Ted.
How much of the screenplay do you adjust once you have the cast in place and you're on location? Is it 10%, 15%? You surely make some adjustments in the dialogue and your vision as you find what works and doesn't work, and you're dealing with people who are cast and you see them. How much of your screenplay remains intact, and how much do you adjust it along the screen?
Well, that's a good question. I wouldn't put a percentage on it because it really depends. It depends on the actor, but in general, the answer is there is an adjustment, and I have to be open to. Actors always want to bring you ideas, and they always want to change dialogue, and you have to really be careful. You have to be, open to a good idea and not be so protective of your precious words that they don't actually do come up with some good stuff. In fact, I'll give you 2, 3, 4 different cases, all right, that of actors. One, Gene Hackman. Gene Hackman comes from the theater. The theatrical tradition is you don't change a word unless you get the approval of the writer. And he was not so respectful of the director, and he brutalized him. But the writer, me, he wouldn't change a comma. I also learned something else from him, and this was part of the process of the maturation of a screenwriter, of actually being on a set and making a movie. And that is that Gene came to me in our first script meeting and took me aside and said, "Do you see?" And he went through the script, and the only time this ever happened, by the way, actors removing lines. He said, "You see this line here? I don't need to say it, I can act it." So he was emphasizing, and he understood the importance of behavior and action of an actor. Someone else, a great writer said, a great screenwriter said, as opposed to the theater, dialogue is my last resort in telling the story. And he said the purest cinema was silent cinema. But the second example was Dennis Hopper. Now Dennis ingested so many drugs over the years that he had a very difficult time learning lines. So every time he opened his mouth, something different came out. And a lot of times it was absurd and had made no sense, but sometimes, every once in a while, it was like, wow, that's better than what I wrote. There are some people who think they know, some actors that think they really know the right way of their character would talk, but oftentimes I believe they're wrong. But again, you have to stay open. You have to stay open because you have to respect what the actor brings to it. The actor brings something, his own tool and his own instincts. And he's really, the character I create is only half there, and the actor completes it. Even though he says my words, and he changes the tone, the tenor, the color and the behavior of that actor. Sometimes it's just physiognomy, but oftentimes more than that, it's an energy. I will give you one last example, and that was Jerry Butler. For those who saw The Game of Their Lives, he played the goalkeeper and the lead in the movie. He was a Scottish actor, and he is an ex-lawyer. So he came to me with every single line of dialogue, and he wanted to debate me about it. Part of it was he had difficulty saying certain words because of his accents, because he had to, create an American accent. But more than anything, it was the lawyer side of him. That just he loved conflict, and he loved the dialectic. And as opposed to Barbara Hershey, he was really smart. And oftentimes I would say no, and then I'd go back to my room and say, maybe he has a point, maybe he's right. And then I'd come back and I said, okay, I think you're right. Maybe it's better if you do say it that way. We actually, it proved to be it was such a good working relationship that I put off writing the locker room speech at the end. I written way too many locker room speeches, and I had run out of ways to do it. So, and I was just avoiding it. I had to be written in the screenplay for the entire time. But I asked Gerard Butler, he's the guy who actually played Phantom of the Opera, that movie. And I said, let's collaborate. Let's write this together. So I said, I'm going to write a first draft, you write a second draft. So we kept on trading drafts. And in the speech he gives at the end, I don't know who wrote what. So it can work great.
Do you find it challenging, like channeling your emotions and your stories in an industry that is focused on making a profit and they're always on like the bottom line and stuff?
Oh, it's impossible. Yeah, I mean, if you actually looked at the obstacles, I don't know if you'd really it makes a lot of sense to do this as a living, but. I think we got lucky with a couple movies, and I've been able to continue to make movies. It writes scripts for money, but it's harder and harder to make the kind of films like Rudy and Hoosiers. As I said earlier, the best writers really work in television now. There's more of a demand. HBO and Showtime are doing more challenging shows. There is much more emphasis on the bottom line and the globalization of the product. That really has changed things. When Hoosiers came out, 75% of the total gross of a film was domestic and 25% international. Now it's the opposite. So a film will not get made unless the marketing department decides that they can sell it overseas. And by the way, the head of production of any studio is second in command to the president of marketing. Because if the marketing guy says, I can sell it, there's a chance getting made. But if he says, I can't sell it, he's Dr. No. It's the death of a project. I've had a number of projects go that direction. I wrote a biography, I wrote a biopic, hate that term, but called Mickey Mantle, about Mickey Mantle's life. And the president of Fox 2000, the president of production at 20th Century Fox recommended it to film. The president of marketing said, baseball is death overseas except Japan and the Dominican Republic. We can't sell it. No one will care. The movie's dead. Simple as that. Yes?
I'm fascinated by your screenwriting rule of never looking back, and I believe you that you don't. Would you comment on the process for successive drafts? Do you adhere to the same rule as you?
I'm sorry, for what?
What about successive drafts? The second draft?
Oh no. Once I'm done, completed my first draft. The character, the voices, I'm sure of. The voices have become authentic, hopefully, and organic in that process. And then I can go back to doing what I did before. I can be the editor. I can use the rational, linear, objective side of my brain, and work with the plasticity. I mean, work with the form then. But no, I'll jump around with it, and I'll do my own rewrite first before I give it out. And of course, that's the other thing that's different about a screenplay than any other kind of creative medium, that when you finally turn it in, there's about 25 people who read it who basically are not filmmakers. You know, they're studio people. And they're there because they're clever agents, or they once were, you know, and they were in entertainment law and at Disney, and they moved over because they were good. There's all sorts of reasons they're there, but they're not filmmakers. And they all want to justify their existence. They all want to justify their jobs. So they will come down on you with ridiculous comments. And by the way, because a lot of these executives don't really know quite what to make of writers anyway. They like working with actors or directors, but writers are a different breed. They sometimes take those screenwriting classes so they can drop those little, you know, we need some rising action or falling action in page 30. It's a bitch. Okay.
Other question is a visual aspect or words, visual aspect and music. Do you ever think about music when you write a screenplay?
I don't. I know a lot of people do, and occasionally I never liked reading a screenplay if someone's going to say, and Beethoven's Fifth plays when, you know, he rises from the bed or whatever. No, it drives me insane. No,
when you write, do you hear music?
Do I hear music when I'm writing?
Do you know what kind of music you would like for a specific scene?
After the amount of time I've spent with films and scores, I know, yes, I do know a certain kind of tonality, and it's supporting what's there. You know, that's really what film music is best at. You should never notice the music. But in terms of instrumentation, the films we've done classic scores.
Rudy had wonderful music.
It was a classic score done by one of the great film composers.
Do you have any input into what kind of...
Very much. You know, what we do as filmmakers is we sit with the composer and we look at the film, and what we do, we spot it. And when that is, we actually pick the frame where we want the music to come in. It's a collaborative effort where the music comes in and where it goes out. And sometimes then we talked about themes, we talk about ideas, we talk about some instrumentation. But again, we worked with Jerry Goldsmith, who's gotten 16 Academy Award nominations. He knows a little bit more about this than we do, and not being musicians. However, having said that, when you actually go to the scoring session, we can hear something that doesn't feel right to us, that can feel too big. I know this happened at Rudy. There were a couple of moments where it felt like it was too big, and we talked to Jerry about it, and he said, okay, and it's his job is to not, he's trying to serve us. So what he did was he took 10 strings out and made it much more austere. That's an example. Or we oftentimes will think that we need a piece of music there, and then we'll put it in there, and it doesn't feel right, so we'll pull it. Or the obverse can happen, which is that, you know, we can say, oh, we missed this. You know, how can we need a piece of music here. So Jerry will come up with an idea of how to use the existing music and pop something in. Yes?
Yeah, what movies have you seen recently that you thought were like particularly good or just really enjoyable?
That's funny. That's funny. I was afraid somebody was going to ask me. I haven't seen anything. I mean, it's really been... Well, here's something else I do. When I'm writing a first draft, I avoid films. Because here's the other thing that happened to me when I was in grad school. I was not really enjoying films anymore because I was analyzing them. I was thinking about them. I could see the architecture behind it, and I was breaking down the scenes and thinking about transitions, and I wasn't opening up. I wasn't letting it flow through me. I go to films with my kids. So I've seen a bunch of kids movies, none of which I've really been too crazy about. Like, I like Cars. I thought Cars is a pretty good movie.
Oh,
you've mentioned a couple times, I could teach you everything I know about screenwriting, a couple hours, everything about filmmaking in a week, and I just wondered if you consider like a, I don't know, half-day workshop. Or you could offer.
I could do that. I could do that. You know, one of Orson Welles' famous lines, Orson Welles had really never been on a film set before he directed Citizen Kane, considered by many the greatest film ever made. I mean, Orson was a genius, that should say that parenthetically, but he said, I learned everything there was to know about directing in 1 week. And he said, the cameraman told me what he could do with the lighting, what the lenses, what images were caught by which size lenses, and he certainly knew acting. So the technical side of it is not really that difficult in terms of filmmaking. And you know, there's a language. We all understand the language. We know when we're writing that movie in our mind, we know what we want to see. And one of the great lines, Robert Towne, wonderful, wonderful, one of the great screenwriters, Chinatown, among many others, Shampoo. He ended up directing a number of films too. He said, when I hand my script to a director, it's already been directed once. That's the other thing that I noticed about really the great scripts. They had a real sense of it was a suggested visuality. They weren't playwrights, you know, vamping. They weren't journalists thinking this is another way to make a living. These were people who understood by just suggestion where the camera is going to be placed in the scene. You know, and doing it in a way that was not so obvious. They didn't do close-up, middle shot, any of those sort of indications. But they did it in very subtle ways. She picks up a rose and looks at it carefully. I mean, you don't do that in a long shot. You know, and I think if you think visually, you think about that movie in your mind, as I keep on saying. And that's what I do. I'm a filmmaker. And the film I make is in my mind. And I try to translate that film in my mind. There's no other kind of writing I'm interested in doing. There's no other kind of writing I would know how to do. I'm not really interested in the theater because that's all dialogue driven. I'm averse to dialogue. So I tell stories with pictures and behavior and action.
Where do you look for stories?
I have got 10 movies I want to write. They come from everywhere. There's no one answer to that. I'll hear something, it'll strike a chord, and I'll think about it more. There's 5 films I want to write that I'm really excited about writing. And I'm creating a situation. One of the reasons it was great about moving back to Bloomington is I'm creating a kind of financial independence that I don't have to write screenplays for a living. I can write the screenplays I want to make, the movies I want to see. And I'm excited about that.